Welcome back to another episode of Upon Request. My name is Mikel Lejean. I'm here with Eric Johnson, Carolina Santamaria, and Lilah Drafts-Johnson, who we're going to share a little bit more about in a second. Today's episode, we're digging in a little bit about the wide world of sports, and not just sports as the viewer and the fandom, but also just the more nuanced relationship that we have with sports as society, as communities, as individuals, trying to explore what sports means to our bodies and our experiences. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit more with Lilah, Caro, and Eric today on that. And I think this episode was a bit inspired by a renewed sense of fandom of recent. I've been boycotting the NFL since about 2013, actually, partially because of a lot of the domestic violence stuff that was happening, and then also watching Ray Rice and Tom Brady get the same exact suspensions for one being like a violation of the amount of air in a football, and the other one being striking your partner in the face in an elevator. And I felt really icky, and I was like, I don't enjoy this sport anymore. But I'm starting to come back and wanting to like learn more about sports in ways that I never watched them for. Getting more into soccer, I've actually started playing in an organized sports soccer rec league with my team, the Soccer Mommies, who I love and appreciate so much. And learning a sport at the age of 31, now 32, is wild. And there's so much about your body that you have to like learn and attune to. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to kind of dive in about this topic and hear more from someone who um, has like a pretty like close relationship to being an athlete in a sense. So yeah, we're gonna dive more into that. So we have with us Lilah Drafts-Johnson, and I hope, am I saying it right? Is it Lilah or Lilah?
Oh,
Lilah?
it's Lilah, unless we're speaking in Spanish. Yeah.
Okay. How would you say it in Spanish? Let's give that a
Lila.
go.
Yeah.
Lila. I
Yeah.
love that. Caro, if you want to break that out every once in a while, I love that.
I was
Um,
gonna say that's beautiful, beautiful name.
yeah, it's a great name. So today we have with us the 2018 NCAA Division III 400 meter hurdles champion. I hope I got that all right. Is that the right characterization?
Yep.
Sick.
Yep.
Lila's also contributed to the D3 Glory Days podcast and is finishing her master's, which I'm sure she can tell us more about. But from what I've gathered, it's focused on the role of the built environment and factors on the body and sports. She's also helped build policy to curtail the prevalence of gender-based violence in sport. And I'm super honored to have her as part of this podcast, and we're all really excited to dive in. Lilah, welcome in. Tell us a little bit more about you. What should people know about you? What do you want people to know about you? Give us the deal, the tea.
Incredible. Thanks so much, Mikkel and Caro and Eric and the whole Upon Request family. I'm very excited to be here today. Like Mikkel said, I think a good place to start with things to know about me is a lot of my sort of professional and kind of academic approaches to sport are really based in my experience as a college athlete in track and field. I've additionally kind of worked as a collegiate coach for track and field. I spent 2 years working at Major League Baseball, the league office. And during that time, my primary role was working on the education and prevention components of the domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse policy there. And today I continue to do some consulting work with different kind of professional men's sports leagues on those different issues. And I just wrapped up my master's a couple months ago. It was at the University of Maryland, College Park. And it's in this really difficult to explain field of study called physical cultural studies / kinesiology. So kinesiology, study of the body, study of movement. A lot of people usually think about, the PTs you go to when something's wrong, something's not working. And that is definitely what a lot of people in kinesiology study. The Physical Cultural Studies Research Group at UMD specifically kind of looks at, how is sport a reflection of society, and how do we kind of study sport to better understand society? So in the courses that we teach and the kind of fields of study we look at, we look at things at how do things like race, class, gender, sexuality, how do all these different factors impact our experience of sport, as well as the location and the moment that sport is happening in. How does that impact other people's experience of sport? There's a lot of work looking at social justice issues in sport, as well as the built environment, and so we can get in a little bit more to kind of what all that means. But I spent the last 2 years kind of more in academia, working on some specifically research projects around domestic and sexual violence or gender-based violence prevention in sports through that program. And I usually just kind of say I'm a researcher, writer, facilitator, educator, really anything that kind of allows me to continue this very niche passion of kind of violence prevention and sports. And I think that's most of the things to kind of know about me. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for introducing yourself and for joining us on this podcast. And I think where I kind of want to start is actually on that piece of social justice in sports. And I think where I want to start is, people might want to see the eradication of things, and sometimes they latch on to, well, if we don't want like gender-based violence of any sort, if we don't want, this kind of like toxic masculinity in our society, the first place to start is to like remove these things, right? And to like, or to kind of bludgeon it in a sense, soften the edges of it. And it's really interesting with sports is that like, you can create policies or you can create rules that change how the sport itself impacts the players, but what about how does the sport and the industry impact the types of activities that occur within it? And I think like the NFL is a really good example of this. I think maybe it's only because my attention has been more drawn to it of late, but we're seeing this in like the amount of power and money and wealth that's amassed amongst these soccer players and kind of what they get away with in those leagues. So like kind of it could be like this really big all-encompassing question, but like how do you think that our approach as a society should be with sports and trying to reduce some of these less savory parts of sports in general? And do you think that there's a way to like have a significant lessening of all these like really terrible things that we see with athletes?
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So like to me, it's sort of you're asking like, do we think that social justice and sport can be compatible? And like,
Mm-hmm.
Can we actually use sport as a platform for social change? Is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, I think this is like a really great place to start out because I think I often feel like I'm kind of straddling a lot of worlds that feel very different. And often when I'm in spaces with people that are really passionate about issues of equity and social justice, and I sort of bring up like all of my sports stuff, there is definitely like ooh, you are not who I thought you were. A little bit like, how could this person, there a lot of people have a lot of quite frankly like trauma attached to sport, and a lot of you've kind of like alluded to a lot of the really, really dark parts of it. And then sort of sitting in another camp are these people that are like, sport has this tremendous platform. It's like a space where people can connect and bridge divides. And, I'm speaking in like sort of extremes, but there's like the people that are like, yeah, like we got to get rid of sports. Sports are bad. And then we got the people on the other side that are like, sport is good. It develops people. It makes, better, stronger, more like disciplined people, and character development. We can use sport to, do things like I do, like teach and talk about domestic and sexual violence prevention, and unify, bring world peace, things like that. And so the approach I try to have is something like in the middle, which is just sort of like, sport does not have this like timeless essence. Sport is a reflection of the moment we're in and the society we're in. And so, I'm speaking to a lot of my experiences living in the United States, with all the different identities I have. And my experience of sport is going to be really different than someone else's. And so that's sort of like the first thing I just like want to say in this conversation is, I'm not like a pro sport person. I'm not an anti-sport person. Let's like speak about sport in a super nuanced way. But to get back to your question, Mikkel, I guess I think that like, I do think that there is this tremendous power in sport, and it would be really great if we can continue to figure out how to use it for good more than it's being used for not. And I think you kind of spoke to the fact that, with all the money that's invested in it, and that just like is really changing not only what sports are being viewed by people, but also it's what's happening at like the professional level is trickling down to even like the kids that are playing. And so I think there's a way that we can like use sport for good, but I think the first thing we need to understand is that like sport is just sport, or sport is it's not this like timeless thing. It's a reflection of like everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that totally eluded the question, but those are some of my thoughts.
No, I mean, yeah, I like kind of went into that question knowing that it was a vast, all-encompassing question to open us up, but I think it's a really good grounding in some of the other places that we can kind of like the offshoots that come from this conversation, right? Where, when we start talking about increasing the gender parity and the participation of like women within sports, you can't start talking about that without talking about the problems that exist at this current moment with the sport, right? Like there's a phenomenon that's happening where for some reason the types of injuries that are occurring for professional level soccer players that of the female gender are unique to the female body. And there has been such a dearth of research and resources and attention to this that basically teams are starting to invest tons of resources into like figuring out like why is it that there's an ACL injury every 6 months from like our star players. And some of it is because the cleats aren't made for the women's body, they're made for the men's body, and then they're made smaller. The soccer ball is like not made with any indication of this, the type of physical dimensions of like the leg of a female body. And it's not to say that we need to reinvent the wheel or reinvent sport, but I think that it does call into question, how do we get that alignment so that everyone can participate? Because I think that the benefits for sport and the positives that we will, I think, talk about throughout this conversation far outweigh the negative things that we see. And I think it's actually because sport is so closely associated with this really negative normative that we keep on seeing these kinds of problems exist. It's because it's a very patriarchal system. It's because it's very capitalistic in its business model. It's because it's super extractive when you think about college athletes. And so yeah, it's a very nuanced conversation, and I really like your thing of that. It's reflective of where society is in a time, and it's not more than that. It's not less than that, and I don't think we need to make it more or less than that. It's kind of the same thing with conversations about money. Money is not more than it is, and it's not less than it is. It's about how we as a society do things in relationship with it that make it have whatever kind of powers it does. So yeah, I really appreciate kind of you starting us off with that that unwieldy question to get us landing somewhere. And yeah, kind of just want to pitch it over to Eric or Kato to see if y'all have any questions or thoughts, or does it kind of elicit anything that you've been thinking about as well of late?
I'm also wondering if I could just make one quick direct response.
Yeah, please do.
So the one thing I will say, just because you brought up ACL injuries and female athletes, is I was actually I was just talking about this with someone, but that is like another example of how, you know, we mostly think about the body in these like bioscientific ways of like the ways that like men and women have different bodies and things like that. But it also is the way that we as a society treat those different genders. And one of the sort of like new things we're realizing about why so many women have ACL injuries is because women are like relegated to using worse facilities. So women are more likely to be using like turf fields, for example, to do soccer practices and stuff like that. And ACL injuries are like way more likely to occur on those fields. And so that's just sort of like an example of like, just to sort of like add in that dimension of like, how do we understand the body? It's not just like that biological stuff, but it's also like, wow, like the social, the decisions we've made as a society about how to like, where do we put these bodies? How do we nourish those bodies? So I just wanted to add that because it's a thing a lot of people don't know about. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
I was gonna ask because it's like, to Mikkel's point, that was a really like, it's like he basically just asked you like, what is sport? You know, like I was like, it was pretty a big question. You mentioned something that I thought was interesting, was the sort of like influence that what we think of as like major league sports have. I think you said trickle down into like different different levels, because it's athletics is such a gigantic range from like soccer when you're like 4 years old and you have like the bumblebee vibe where everyone's running around to like the major league. So just like, I was interested, I don't know, I wanted to ask like, what do you see from how what we think of as the very, very small percentage of athletes, which are professional athletes, how is that business? How do you see that influence more amateur level sports, whether it go all the way down to, you know, college and then to high school and then even earlier, or just general rec sort of sports? Like, what sort of influences have you seen from your time at MLB or other places where you've been closer to the business?
Yeah. Just because I think it's fun, I kind of want to like kick the question back to you all and ask you, like, when you think of sport, what are like the dominant values you associate with like sport? Like what makes someone like good at sport? I'm like, it's sort of like a thought exercise, if you don't mind.
I think of like two things. Sorry, go ahead. You go ahead. Okay. I was gonna say like, it's like, I think a little bit of talent, and then I do think of like hard work. So like, I think what comes up when I think of like the positive values in sports is that it does, it can be used for a lot of things. It can teach cooperation, even though it is in a competitive environment, which is sort of like ironic in a way. And then also, how something can be fun but also hard at the same time, I think is interesting. But like, when I think of someone who's good at it, which is something I've always been very mediocre, I feel like, my entire life as an athlete. I was always like okay, but I was never like, no gold medals, you know, nothing like that. There's like, it's a mix of like just talent and working hard is what I generally see people who are successful in sports have, which is maybe extremely simplistic, and I'm sure you have much more to say on it than I do, but that's like the first students I think of. But Kata, I kind of cut you off. Sorry about that.
I think we were both just going at the same time. Yeah, I on top of what sort of Eric said, I think so much so I have ADHD, and I played a lot of sports in high school, and I really attribute sports to giving me discipline, routine, time management, cooperation. Like I think for especially as like a young kid with a lot of energy and just, very extroverted, it was sports were always like a way that I feel like I also gained a lot of confidence. And I do think, like, into sports go the elements of, yeah, talent, especially for folks that are going on to much higher levels. But I made a lot of my friends through sports, and I gained a lot of hand-eye coordination doing sports. So I think it also goes a lot into the mind. Like mentally, it's actually proven that sports really help regulate kids with ADHD. So we're talking about dopamine regulation. We're talking about actual chemical changes that are happening in kids' bodies that are doing sports and exercising that actually really help regulate their emotions, get their energy out. So when I think of sports, I think there's so much wrapped in it. There's obviously like the professional sport level thought of sports, but I think of sports as like a community event. So the community is getting together. I just DJ'd the little boy that I nanny's baseball game like last Saturday. I think of just like, meeting the people in your community and like gathering. And I think those are like the first things that come to mind when I personally think about sports, which I think, as a person that plays sports, I have a certain perspective. And I know that that's not always the perspective of folks that actually find it really inaccessible to be part of sports culture in general.
Yeah. I also don't want to gloss over the fact that you said you DJ'd like a little kid's baseball game, which is like, what is your life now, Kato? It's very eclectic.
I know. It's my side hustles have really expanded
your horizons. Yeah, I think y'all captured most of what I would respond with. I think I remember the like consistent debate in the locker room was always this thing of the folks that are really precise about the things that they're good at versus the folks that are athletes. And there was in the football locker room, it was always, would you rather have a running back that knows all the plays and knows how to get to the hole, as we call it, the fastest, and like knows how to remember all that stuff and is in practice, like kind of speaking to that hard work piece that Eric was mentioning, knows how to do the thing right every time? Or do you want the guy that can like run the lights out and will find a way to the end zone? And it was always this debate of what type of person do you want on your team? And I think it always kind of oscillates between those things of like who excels the most at a sport. Is it the person that really knows how to do the technical bits, or is it the person that just is athletically gifted enough to make anything work? And I don't want to like over kind of like give too much weight to either one of those, but I also do think that this idea about like teamwork and camaraderie and the type of community and environment also determines what experience you have as an athlete, as well as if you have a horrible locker room energy and your team is terrible, it's like the compounding of like the worst of both worlds. But somehow the most successful teams can have the really toxic environment, and how much people flourish within that environment also changes a lot. And so I think that's where I think that there's maybe less clarity for me, is like what actually is the best environment for people to learn sport in that makes the best for their experience. And that's why I question a lot of times, the guys talk back in like high school, even I would just get really frustrated with of, well, like women just aren't good at sports. And I'd be like, but how many times have you seen like the women's basketball team like have the same attention even in the weight room? Right? Like how many times have you seen them get like the facility? How many times have you seen them get bumped off the court because, oh, now the like men's team is playing? It's like this idea of, are we even making the best of the folks that we do have who have the talent, maybe just not the attention or the built environment to succeed. So I don't know. It's a really good question back, but back to you, Lilah.
Okay, you all are like way too thoughtful because yeah, it's so interesting to see like what this brings up, and it's really really helpful for me to like understand your different frameworks for understanding it. The reason I asked is because usually when you ask, what equals good athlete equals good team, good coach in sport, is people are like, it's the team that wins. It's winning. Who's the fastest? Who's the strongest? But those are just like beautiful responses, and what I want us to all kind of move towards. And so to kind of like circle it back to Eric's original question of like how so and so I'm curious, like would you guys like agree like that is that like usually kind of like winning is like the dominant, like that's like the standard, that's how we like sort of are as a society, like sort of speaking in like terms of like the dominant culture, like that's how we determine like what's good.
And maybe this is over.
I think yes and no, yeah. In like data and statistics, I feel like, because you can be
Yeah.
like an individual player on a team and be fantastic, but your team could be losing. I don't know. But winning, yeah, generally,
But-
like being the best, like high point percentage.
Yeah. So, and so the reason I bring that up is because that generally, I would say, is the way that like those like top level, like, Olympics, the Olympic system, the different professional leagues, like that is like mainly their metric for success. I think maybe that's would have been a better question, is like, how do you like define success in sports? And so the thing I think about is like, unless you're taught to kind of critically reflect on like, what is it that I am like coming to this, whether it's like you're 30, did you say you're 31 or 32, Miguel?
Well, I'm 32 now. Yeah.
Yeah, like whether you're like, trying out a new sport for the first time in your 30s, or you're like, when you're like 7 and doing like Munchkin soccer, you're not thinking about like, why am I joining this community? But if you don't have like any other kind of value system in place, like that's the one you're going to measure yourself against, and that's the one that unless we like are intentionally kind of teaching coaches to value those other things that you guys brought up of like community building and how does like testing your limits, and like learning new things, that's like the only way we're sort of teaching sports. And so I think it's one thing, to some extent, it's like, it might be that we do want like those elite athletes and like the professional athletes to be on that metric. I don't totally agree with that, but I can see the argument for it. Like we want to see like the best of human performance, and that's, what we're interested in watching. But it's like, like, is that what we want for our like 7-year-olds who are playing soccer for the first time? But the thing is, like, so many coaches in this country are, and frankly, I don't know as much about in other places, but generally coaches is like, it's unless you're, coaching a football team or you're coaching at that high level, you're usually a volunteer. You're usually someone that maybe has a kid participating. So you're not someone that necessarily has like a lot of education about how to do this, what is like a really intimate job, I think, which is like you are teaching young people often about how to treat their bodies and like treat other bodies. And I think that's sort of what I see as like trickling down, is like we have over time started to like approach college sports the same way we approach professional sports. And we are now approaching high school sports as how we're treating college sports. And that is going all the way down to, there's these parents who will be specializing their kid in, they're not doing as much sports sampling. So doing, lots of different sports and trying stuff out. And then, eventually in middle or high school, you might find one that kind of sticks and works for you and you dedicate yourself to that. But what we're seeing in kind of national trends is a lot of kids that are like their parents are like, I'm looking to get you on a D1 roster, and that's going to start at the age of 5. And I think a lot of it is because we aren't asking that question. And that was kind of why I posted all of like, yeah, like how do you all define success in sport, and it's something I would like ask our listeners too is, what's the point of sport for you and in each of the contexts that you are doing sports in. So Eric, I hope I answered enough of your question. And
yeah, no, that's great. No, and it actually, it made me think of, and sorry, like Mikkel's gonna roll his eyes because I'm a huge Milwaukee Bucks fan. That's my sport. And so Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's a basketball player, he got a lot of hate for saying, after they were eliminated from the playoffs last year, that there is no failure in sports. And essentially what he was saying is that like the whole point is that like you're not, some days it's not your day. And the whole reason that we're here is to keep trying to get better. And the interesting part about that to me was the backlash to it. Everyone was like, what are you talking about? No, you absolutely failed. Like that was sort of like the narrative in the media was that it was a total failure. So I just thought that was interesting, talking about success versus failure. And when it's in, especially that highest level, if the message is, if you don't win at all, you didn't do anything good, then like, what's the point to me? Like, because you're not going to be that good all the time, I think, unless you are, in which case good for you. But like, I think that's probably not a good message to send. But yeah. Sorry. Other questions?
Yeah, Kato, what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I just had a thought when you were talking because some parents did take the 9-year-olds, 8-year-old baseball game that I went to very seriously. I'm in Orange County, so they're, these very, I feel like high pressure parents that are just like, my kid is like going to the best private school with the best like sports teams, and I just like look at the kids and I'm like, they just want to have fun, and it's just a lot of pressure. There's so much loaded into that, but mostly my questions come from a place of being like a femme person that has always participated in sports, and sort of the perception and the ability for us to participate in conversations or be seen as like a legitimate person with legitimate knowledge in sports. Would love to hear about your experience, especially in talking about those types of things, like saying, turf court, like, women are mostly playing in these. And I say this with the experience. I played college tennis, and my sophomore year, they got rid of our tennis team because their excuse was they paved over the tennis courts where we used to play. But we, at the school across the street from us, Simmons College, got to keep their, tennis team. And we believe it was possibly because of a Title IX issue. There was no men's team, only a women's team. But like all of the teams that got funding at our college were lacrosse. They were men's sports, right? Except maybe for the women's basketball team, because they really rock at Emmanuel. Also, at UCI, I'm at the University of Irvine because my partner is doing a PhD here, and the UCI men's team did not make March Madness, but UCI women's team did. So yay, women's sports. So yeah, mostly my questions are just pertaining to your experience in advocating, particularly on that. Like, I hate talking about the gender binary. We're also talking about like trans athletes, non-binary athletes. Like, what does it look like having these conversations, and how do you feel like you're perceived in spaces where, we're talking about a culture that a lot of people find very toxic, which is why they don't participate in sports. When sports are so much more multifaceted than that toxic culture that we're talking about, right? So that's like very loaded, but I would love to hear your thoughts on just those experiences.
Yeah, I just thought that was such a beautiful question that allows me to answer in a really expansive way. So I appreciate it. Yeah, I think, the thing that draws me to the kind of work I do, like specifically with gender-based violence prevention in sport, is sort of because of this tension where throughout my life, especially as like a young girl growing up, sport was one of the few places where I felt like I didn't always like, I wasn't perceived first as a girl or a woman. Like the first thing especially if I could be excellent in sport, it was like, first, I'm an athlete. And sort of my like womanhood is like the second most interesting thing. But then the flip of that is obviously there's still a lot of like harassment and, catcalling when you go for runs and inappropriate comments by coaches and things like that. And so like sport is not at all like a safe space from those things. And so while it was this place where, whereas in a lot of my life, I felt very like uncomfortable in my body and things like that. It was like the space of empowerment, but when that empowerment was violated in those contexts, it was sort of, especially damaging, because that was sort of, that was like my safe space. That was where I got to, and I think that's just because, as, like as a woman, we're just like taught so much to appreciate our bodies for what they look like and not so much for like what they can do. And so it was just really cool to like get to push the limits of what I could do and to be acknowledged for that, as opposed to like other things. And so that's sort of what I say is like sport is both the place that I've been most empowered, uplifted, felt the strongest and most confident, and it's also the place that I've really felt the most kind of violation. And it's sort of my desire for it to be the latter or the former. Can't mess those words up. Yeah, for it to be a space of empowerment that really drives me. So, when I was in college, I think a really cool thing about track and field is that it's very often co-ed. And I competed for Oberlin College, and Oberlin was just a really great space too, where it was a super, during my time, we had a lot of like queer athletes, a lot of athletes that didn't necessarily identify within the gender binary. And even though they competed for specific teams just based on the restrictions that the NCAA has. And so I really got to sort of have a lot of those kind of normative things that for a lot of people, like sport is it is super ruled by that gender binary. And it was largely, I would say, like a really, just like a really great space for me. But there's definitely, I think I've never been in a context in sport in which there hasn't been sort of that prevailing kind of patriarchal outlook. And, and that was always kind of a lot of what fueled me was, as when I practiced, I would be sort of in this weird, I was sort of in a weird situation where I wasn't quite fast enough to run with the men for all of the practice, but I didn't always have teammates that were able to sort of assist me with my workouts. And so those are, I guess I'm just sort of like throwing out some of my responses to your question, Caro, but I think it's like, yeah, just really, yeah, I really do love to see, I really love to see sort of like those sort of norms broken of like who's good in sport. And then the other thing is too, like, I'm sort of like losing my train of thought because there's a lot of different directions to go with this question. So I'm going to kind of shift a little bit into, I think you were kind of asking about, yeah, like, so you're in a lot of these spaces where it is mostly men. And certainly with the workshops I used to and still sometimes facilitate with men's leagues, yeah, I'm a former female athlete, and here I am to talk about this lovely subject that everyone, wants to have a discussion with all of their teammates. And I will say that I do try to sort of ground myself in a group by just sort of saying like, I'm not here because I'm trying to, I'm here because I love sports. This is my background in sports. It might not be impressive to you. The point I want you to take away from it is I'm someone that can appreciate, a love of trying to constantly improve. And And part of that for me is, accountability. And so I'm curious to talk today about, what does accountability look like on this team? And how can we create space to be our most full selves with our team? And how will that, help us as athletes? And so I sort of frame it in a lot of language that at first glance is what does this have to do with violence prevention? And then, we hit them with the talking about gender norms and how does a lot of the norms of masculinity that are reinforced in sports of using violence to solve conflicts, the sort of the dominant kind of model of dominating others is this huge thing in sport. And kind of the culture of disposability that is also really prevalent, especially, at that elite level. And I just sort of try to connect the dots with, or, how is not being able to ask for help as a male athlete that's struggling with body image issues, which so many men do. And it's just something we don't talk about. And yeah, and all of these things, how is this leading, how is this not only harming women, and trans and queer communities, how is this also harming men? And how is it, yeah. And so that's a little bit of how I try to approach the conversation. And I will say it's definitely I've dipped in and out of sports, and I've moved around a lot, I guess, in my kind of short professional career. And a part of that is because I do think that it's a really difficult space for me to be in a lot of the time, because it's not always, as someone that is doing sort of sexual violence prevention work, for example, most of the time, for example, I talk about how when I worked at MLB, most of the people that work at MLB are there because they're huge fans of baseball and, are working in HR or doing accounting or, whatever kind of job they have. And I was there because I didn't really know that much about baseball, but I cared a lot about violence prevention. And there's, it's a tough intersection to get someone that can talk to athletes and also kind of talk about these topics, because you unfortunately do a lot of the time have to meet people where they're at. And so I feel like I'm rambling all over the place, but that's a little bit of my
Yeah.
response to your question, Kato.
No, that was awesome, and there's a lot of resonance within that too. Also, I just have to say, I ended up doing track because I ran track in high school. So my sophomore year, when they got rid of the tennis team, I joined the track team. You running the 400-meter hurdle, that's y'all, just running a 400-meter is hard. Running it with hurdles, that's impressive. I just want to say that's as a former track college athlete, that's really cool to have under your belt. Just to say to our listeners, if you don't know what a 400-meter hurdle race looks like, look it up on Google. You're jump. I just think it takes a lot of talent and dexterity. I almost smashed my knee trying to do hurdles, so it was never for me. But I really loved your response, and I think it's really cool I had just a thought as you were saying all of this. In so many ways, we do really find comfort and safety in sports as femmes in sports as well. I think so much of my, like I said, so many of my really, really good friends come from sports. And just to say that it's also really interesting to hear that even now you have trouble in those spaces. There's still spaces that are really dominated by these narratives. And I think so much about, I used to be a huge football fan, like Mikkel, and like Mikkel, I stopped watching for many reasons, but mostly for a feeling of uncomfortableness with the culture of violence that oftentimes came, but not even just, the outside domestic violence issues, but CTE and the way that players were allowed to participate in the game, the way the NFL censored players during a time when a majority Black and brown player pool wants to stand up. I think so much of the Colin Kapernick things that have happened, and that has really alienated me from certain sports. I feel like I love basketball so much because I just like learned about Jaylen Brown, y'all. I'm a very like new basketball fan. My partner is like super into basketball. And just like he does so much for his community in Boston. And I just love when athletes also like are really big advocates. I would love to hear a little bit more about maybe your thoughts and perspectives of how athletes participate in social justice and what like that dichotomy can look like as someone that is an advocate within this space already.
Okay. Yeah. I think I just think the explosion that we've seen in the last like 10 years even, or even like 5 of athletes that are willing to speak out about social justice issues is really incredible. And it's not unprecedented, but it's just at a scale right now that is pretty unprecedented. And I think it's almost like hard to remember, but I do feel like we're coming from this idea around sport that this like sport media has a huge role in playing, in which like the narrative was always like everything's political except for sport. Like sport is supposed to be like this apolitical space where there's we're all on a level playing field and all that. And we know in 2024 that that's clearly not true, but even in like that was a lot of the rhetoric that it's just really interesting because I think you can look at a lot of what kind of the Republican Party has done by using, especially Colin Kaepernick, to sort of like rile people up around sports, and so it's just really interesting because before that was sort of a group that was always like sport isn't political, and now they're sort of the ones that are really politicizing sport, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or it's trans women in sport. So okay, I think that's like my ramble before kind of responding more directly to the question. But I think athletes are like, especially at elite levels, in a pretty difficult position, and have this like enormous platform. But the thing I do kind of want to always kind of remember is that like that athletes are, I don't know, like not always like necessarily like the best like
like spokespeople for issues. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. And so I think it's like really, really great, but also I am sort of like let's like let them like use the platform, like hopefully like get some money for like the issues that are really important, but leave sort of some of the other stuff to other to the folks that are kind of like actively working on those issues. So that's one thing I think, because I do think that athletes get put in a really tight space a lot of the time with that. Not to like absolve them of like their political commitments, but I think it's a thing to remember. I guess I'm kind of struggling with this question. Was there like, I don't know, were there parts of it you were kind of hoping to get at more, Kato?
No, I think you kind of answered it, because I think it's something that we all struggle with, like, seeing these folks that we put on a pedestal speak about issues that we have an affinity to, but them not always necessarily being the right spokespeople for it. I think you struck a point that I've always been like, I've had trouble with. Like, I do love when athletes speak out, but I also sometimes folks that are not necessarily in the issues, or maybe aren't taking the time to really deeply educate themselves about the nuances of the issues, maybe are going to say some harmful things to really large platforms. So I always go back and forth, because it's like there are actually some athletes that are really big experts in what they do. Like I said, I learned so much about Jaylen Brown, y'all. I did not know he went to Berkeley. Did not know he took a master's level class when he was like a sophomore. But like very, very, like there are some athletes that do know those nuances, and it's like very back and forth, and I think it also plays a lot, I think, so much about the stereotype of athletes not being necessarily very bright people, and how that is so completely wrong. And how this is just like a stereotype that can oftentimes also be permeated in this, when like someone does speak up that is very knowledgeable about something, and then they're like, well, they're just an athlete, so they don't really know anything. Yeah. So you answered my question. You did. I just wanted to hear what your perspective was on like the nuances of athletes participating in like advocacy work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one more thing I'll like append to my answer is that I think a lot about like how I think something that unfortunately like the sport industry, like sports are really good at is like co-opting movements. And we've like like if you've seen an NFL game recently, you've seen the like end racism that's like in the end zone. And then you're like, what about Colin Kaepernick protesting police brutality? And when you like blackballed him from the league. And those contradictions, but you know, now we see like we've just seen the way that like the sport industry has really co-opted like the Black Lives Matter movement, and so I think that's the other thing I'm just sort of like trying to kind of like hold in this in my answer is I am like so we like live in a world today where like the most influential person is like Taylor Swift, and she's like influencing so many things. And I think a lot of it is because of this sort of like the celebrity that we and how much we give to celebrities, including athletes. And I think athletes are I don't want to come across like I'm saying athletes aren't smart enough to like be advocates or anything like that.
Not at all. Yeah.
But they're also political in their own sense, right? Like for every Jaylen Brown you have an Aaron Rodgers, you know,
I was just about to say, like
every end racism campaign, you've got like, you know, Ligue 1 and like most of the soccer leagues doing this end racism or say no to racism or whatever the language is for French. The French are oppressors. I don't really care about their language, but just kidding. I'll take it back. But you know, also like the recent policy around like Ramadan and breaking fast in Ligue 1 was like a very political decision by that body where they won't allow players to break fast during games. During the entire month of Ramadan in Ligue 1, where you've got like Algerian players, you've got like Black Muslim players. So yeah, I think it's such a fair point of like even with the great things that can come out of it, the like platform, celebrity, and capital that these people have access to also allows them an ability to distort what people experience in harmful ways as well. For every like, you know, really great like pro woman feminist soccer player there's a few that have been really bad on other issues too. So yeah, I think it's a really good lesson, I think, for all of us as we're like exploring this, and for listeners as well, is like the knee-jerk reaction to like the echo chamber of someone said something that like is agreeable to me, is like amazing and we need more of it, is like actually not maybe the best protocol. So it's a really good question, Kato, and I think a really good like discussion around it. Eric, you came off mute a little bit ago. I just want to see if you had any thoughts or questions related to this or a new one.
Yeah, sorry for diving into this topic really deep, but I when I think of activist athletes, I think we think of like the Muhammad Ali, we think of like the outspoken
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you more about activism and social justice within the space of athletics, like athletes being advocates for themselves or for each other within the systems that currently exist, as opposed to being like the spokesperson for larger issues. When you were talking about gender-based violence in sports or violence in sports, when you're because you actually talk to athletes about how to be, I assume, better advocates in a way too, right? Not just to be, is it mostly about bettering themselves, or is it about like helping them to embrace being a leader, and in terms of
like holding
being
others
that example
accountable
for each other?
Yeah.
Exactly, outside, and as opposed to the outside world.
Yeah. I guess like to give like a very quick overview of like a typical presentation I might give, it's like a lot of it is some just like basic facts, like here's some statistics around how many different people and experience these different forms of violence. It's also like recognizing forms of abuse and like warning signs, talking about like what is consent, what is not consent, and or like yeah, what's coercion, things. It's like kind of talking through some of those kind of like basic definitions that some people just truly have not like had that kind of educational awareness around. And then a lot of it is like, okay, like what does like a positive bystander look like? What are some more creative ways of intervening in escalating situations than what we've been taught a bystander usually is. But I think the most kind of important thing that I feel like I try to bring in these workshops is like, my understanding of like why gender-based violence happens is like a mix of like unequal power dynamics plus oppressive ideas around gender. And so it's really just like trying to facilitate a conversation with men about what does being a man mean to you, and trying to connect the dots about how that often connects to them committing violence to themselves when it's not allowing themselves to like fully feel and express, and ask for help, or when it's someone else expressing a different way of being a man that causes them to act violence because that's uncomfortable or scary for some reason, or like the ways that can lead to harming a partner. And so that's like that's a little intro.
I think I feel like this has been such a like a even more rich conversation than I could have thought, which I think is the whole point about sports for me, is that it is an entryway into so many parts about our world. Like it's an entryway into our society, into like our relationship with our own bodies, our relationship into our own journeys, right? Like we haven't even scratched the surface on like the socioeconomic like nature of sports, and how we're talking about folks that are their only way out of certain communities is through their excelling at certain sports. And like that is such a big part of like why people struggle and to maintain and be able to like have consistency in how they show up for the sport when they get to the professional level. We've seen it with like gambling, with spending too much, with having too many people asking you for money, like all these things that I think go unsaid. But there was two things that you said that I would love to just hear, maybe some additional thoughts on from the crew, or if it's sparking for others. But I think also a moment of vulnerability is, you were saying, we've gotten away from this idea, and we're starting to like kind of expand this like monoculturing of sports, right? This idea that you can only do one sport and you better be really fucking good at it, or else you're not going to get loved, you're not going to get a college degree, you're not going to get out of high school. Like we're starting to move that monoculturing of sports down the pipeline to like young kids, where now you have like Ball is Life mixtapes for like 8-year-olds, and you're like, what the fuck are we doing, guys? But also the other thing that you were talking about is like, how do we create communities of people that are of similar shared experiences, background, genders, identities, whatever it might be, being able to hold a little bit of accountability, but also like care for one another. Because I feel like for me, I did wrestling, and wrestling is probably one of the more toxic locker rooms, not just because of the toxic masculine kind of nature of it, but also the like body dysmorphia that is rampant. Like we had 12-year-old teammates that were 85 pounds, that were struggling with body dysmorphia, with eating, with keeping on weight. We had a hydration rule that got introduced like kind of in the halfway point of like when I was doing wrestling, because the problem of people jumping around weight classes, me included, from 135 pounds to 185 pounds at like 13, 14 years old was like rampant. And this is at a really significant developmental time. So you're talking about you're messing with people's metabolism for their lifetime. And I've always felt like that was kind of part of my problem with like yo-yoing in weight and diet and stuff. And I always thought like it was just like weird, like that I, of all the people, was like the one that was like always self-conscious and always feeling like a way or whatever it was. But then I learned that it wasn't just me, and there's more conversation around it. And so yeah, I think this thing of like there are some really messed up things that are happening to these student athletes. Like there are, ideas of like body dysmorphia. There is a conscious masculinity that can be present, but for the most part is a very toxic masculinity that is present. And there's ideas of camaraderie, but they're not built on really true communal care practices. It's like sometimes it's on like that bullying community, right? Like it's like we're gonna bully you into like assimilation kind of thing. And so yeah, I'm just like kind of sharing that context to kind of go back into this thing of like how do we right the wrongs of one, the proliferation of this really unhealthy relationship to sport where folks are thinking that at 8 years old you should pick one sport and do that for the rest of your life, but also how do we counter and maybe create a more conscious and like resilient type of masculinity or femininity or identity process within sports. Like do y'all ever think about that? Have you experienced that? If you don't have to say if you don't feel like talking about it, but just yeah, like I don't know if like that's something that others have really like navigated or had to kind of like navigate.
Yeah, I think on the end of maybe like emotional intelligence, kind of like I like one of the things that I noticed with when there's a parent like yelling out at a little kid, at the baseball game that I'm at. And then you see, like, for example, a little boy that I nanny can be really competitive. He's an only child. And I'm not going to use him as an example, but I'll use like a metaphor of like what I've observed with like multiple kids, like on the team or whatever, how upset kids get when they don't win or when they don't hit the ball. And I think so much about how are we setting up kids to meet the realities of life where there are going to be a lot of disappointing things that happen where you're not always going to get your way, you're not always going to win. And I think so much about like the way that sports could be an avenue for, and it is in many spaces an avenue for teaching emotional intelligence and teaching like how to be a good loser. Like I think I learned how to be a good loser from playing individual sports really well because I didn't win all the time and it was up to me, right? And I think emotional intelligence is like something that I feel like gets maybe missed a little bit in sports, especially with really young kids, because there are really competitive parents that are like, well, no, you have to be the best. If you're not the best, like you're a disappointment. Like, my dad loves basketball. I stopped playing basketball because he told me it sucks watching your games because they're not that fun because I really sucked.
No.
I was like in middle school, so my dad was a very toxic sports person. He didn't go to my tennis games because I couldn't take the yelling. My dad was a yeller. I can't take my coach was a yeller too. I was number one singles, so there was like a lot of pressure, and I feel like I don't know. I'm glad that started maybe later in life because I think that pressure as a little kid, I don't know. Just hearing my dad be like, it sucks watching your basketball games. I'm like, okay, well, now I know that I should be disappointed in myself because I'm not good at something. And I feel like it should be the opposite, right? It should be like, actually, I gave it my best and I tried. And like, cool, I got out of my comfort zone, didn't really like it, not going to do that again. That's what you were saying sparked for me, Mikkel, is how it really could actually be an avenue because like, wrestling culture is super toxic and the competitive, I don't know, how do you make competitiveness also like an avenue for learning how to be okay when you don't come out on top?
Yeah, I'm also like thinking about, there's so many people that have such like a bad relationship to sports, either because they got bullied when they did go to gym class or, they never really had an acumen for it. And that the experimentation with play and like sport being one of it is like something that I think we all kind of come around to later in life, like where we're like, we actually find the sport that's super cool for us. And I remember the most like random sport that I learned someone play who had never played any sport in their life was like roller derby. And it was like this
Oh.
queer femme like coworker who I was like, yo, that's actually so dope. And I think it was that thing of they built community. They realized that they did want something that was active, and they didn't have the skills to do other sports. And this sport in particular was super welcoming and inviting for not just folks that are queer and femme and, you know, differing kind of like gender identities, but also for folks that have never played sport before. They were like, yeah, come on in, like whatever's. And yeah, maybe like kind of for listeners, maybe it's just like the filled with regret side of me of like, one, like try new sports. Like you might be at an age where you feel like really terrified about trying a new sport, but there's probably some version or adaptation of a sport that you can play where you don't have to worry about hurting yourself, or like that is accommodating to your different levels of ability, both like physical and also just like technical. And also, I would love to see more people get into coaching that have more emotional intelligence. Like I had like one coach that I can recall that I just like was calm and patient and never yelled and was like super nice to me. But every other, like I had a former, like, no, actually I had a coach who was a parole officer for kids that were on our team. And he just like had such a favoritism towards the kids that were on parole, but the rest of us, he was just like, well, you haven't really been through the struggle, so like you got nothing to give me kind of thing. And he was just mean to everyone else. But yeah, it was just like this kind of thing of like we need more people to like coach and support folks from a place of like genuine care and that thing of emotional intelligence. Like imagine if you had your dad doesn't have to be a different person, but imagine if you had like a different coach that could have been that like support for you at that time. That would have been really cool. So
And my coach was the reason I stayed, because he was like, no, like, what are you talking about? It's not about winning, or it's not about being like good. So God damn, we need those coaches. We need the emotional intelligence. Lilah, I have a very unrelated question to this topic that we're talking about, but do you play any sports currently now that you're like not in college and you're post grad? And congratulations on graduating grad school, but do you do any sports currently?
Oh, what a great question. I'm currently sort of figuring out like what's feeling good for me right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I unfortunately have a lot of injuries from my college career that pretty much keep me from running. And so I can't really do too much of that anymore. But I've been really getting into like cycling and swimming and kind of getting back into weightlifting. But unfortunately, a lot of those are not always the most like what I really would love to do is like join a soccer team and like, have that kind of like team community experience. But I'm hoping to like find some cycling groups in DC soon.
Nice.
maybe some guest spots on the Soccer Mommies.
Maybe. I was a good midfielder back in the day.
Heck yes.
But and I did kind of I wanted to jump into Mikkel's question a little bit, and Eric, I definitely also want to hear your thoughts there. But I guess just like something I will say is like, so for my graduate program, I was like a teaching assistant. Part of what that was, grading, reading student papers. And for one of the classes I taught called Sport and Society, we had this one week where kind of the essay question for the week was about sort of like, why is it that you work out? What brings you to specifically like fitness, not so much like sports. And in the responses that I would get to that question, it was practically like 3/4 of the class that I would have, like all of them spoke to some kind of like eating disorder or body dysmorphia. And that was like across like the men and the women in the class. And that just like really opened me up to the fact that like it's just so crazy to me that we don't talk about that. Like I think that is changing, but I think to me, sort of part of solving a lot of this isn't like, Mikkel, you spoke in the beginning about how like there's always this instinct to like cut things out and like stamp, eradicate. And to me, it's like the way that we fix so many of the problems in sport isn't to like try to, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's not to like try to keep them out of sport, but to acknowledge like, unfortunately, like this is what's in sport. And we have to like acknowledge that there's like a ton of systems at play here that are causing harm. And that is part of the society that we're in. And I think especially like sports leagues are really scared to admit like, yeah, we do have a problem with CTE, with domestic violence, with whatever it is. And unfortunately, I like, because of like legal things, like they're never going to cop up to that. But to me, that's the thing, is like, we really need to, so much of what we see is like, these policies that are meant to hold people accountable that have caused harm. And we definitely need that. But what we also need is like things in place in those leagues for people that have been harmed, so that they're not harming other people, and that like, they are not continuing to experience harm. And that's like, I'm going all over the place, but that's also the way that I like approach the men I speak to, is knowing like, you're people that have also probably experienced a lot of harm. And I think we need to like demand that of leagues and teams as well, is like, don't just wait for harm to happen and then punish the people involved, put in supports, because we know harm is happening here. So that's like just sort of my hot take there. And I think I'll end there because I want to hear Eric. I want to see if Eric, you have any thoughts here.
Well, on I think that'd be such an interesting question when you're like grading papers regarding like why do you do fitness? But I think you could also ask like specifically to sport, because I think of them as very different for me. Like, because like fitness, running, whatever, weightlifting, that's almost like recreation. It's a privilege to be able to do that in a way, right? To like work on oneself and to like take the time to do something for yourself. Where sports is so different, where it's like there is an element of competition to sports, right? That's what makes it different than just pure fitness. I would say, I don't know, there's probably a better definition out there between the two. But I do wonder about how, I think a lot of people now would say that like I'll say for myself, the reason why I work out is mostly for mental health reasons. Like if I don't, I'm a dick. Like I'm just like not fun to be around. I've noticed, like if I'm like, oh, I haven't actually like exercised or ran or anything, like, oh, because I'm depressed, I need to get my life together a little bit. And like there's for me a very clear pattern between the two, where I don't see sports necessarily being something that I need in my life in the same way, where like I do think I need some kind of physical fitness, but I don't know if I need it now. But I think I did. Like I think I did need it at a point in my life where like goals and competition and something to build towards was like really important to me. I don't know, I'm kind of ranting a lot too. But
did you graduate from Grambling State with all that rambling? Never mind,
a little bit. Yeah. No, that was good. But I just wonder if like the motivation for why athletes do what they do, I think there's a huge range for like the motivation of like why you're in sports. Is it for money? Is it for to say I'm really good at something? Is it for to improve my body and my physical appearance? I think there's a lot of different ranges for it. So I think having a better understanding of people's motivations, I imagine, is really helpful. And then also, could those motivations be healthier? Like, could the reason you do sport be for, better goals, like just to have like an overall better mindset on how to approach sports could be helpful.
Yeah. I think, I feel like this is like one of those convos where I really would want to like chat for so long, because I again, I'm just like blown away at just how many places it can go. And I think we should have a part 2 where we mostly talk about how do we promote sport as like self-discovery, expression, that like relationship to body, because I feel like that is just like such a cool topic, and I think also one that's like much more leaning towards that positive. But in community building and care and like all those pieces, but I also think that like if you started with just like the self-discovery piece, like the community that you'd build would be a lot better too, right?
I say that from just having moved to a new place and sport being one of the ways that I've actually met people. I'm
Right.
playing tennis regularly, and that's the only way I've like actually made friends that I'm meeting regularly. So it's like I think as an adult, post grad, sports gives me a community that I just don't, it's hard to build otherwise.
Yeah. And there's really very few things that connect to that particular part of like stimulation, right? Like outside of, you've got work, right? But then outside of work, how else are you stimulated? And it's, you've got
Yeah.
sport. Some people like get their creative endeavors flowing, and that's like very unique to that realm of things. So yeah, I think that more folks knowing like what that stimulation is that they need, and we need more of like a holistic kind of thing. Like you can't just do sport and think that you're all good. Like if you're not tapping into those other pieces, I think we lose a little bit of our holistic humanity as we get older, and as we get further away from like school and stuff. I think it also is harder. But okay, final question, I guess, and then I'll do my big closeout because I have so much to like try to encapsulate. But what's everyone's relationship to sport right now? But also, what do you wish it was? Maybe we can start there. And then Eric's gonna insert like a little ticker timer, like amended version, because we're gonna give everyone more time to think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have one though?
Yeah, I can go first. So, and part of why I didn't answer earlier is I've joked about this with other people. Is like I think I have like the opposite of body dysmorphia. Like I think I am in much better shape and look much better than I actually am. Like so,
it's the white male confidence.
So, a little bit. There's probably something like that, but it's like for me, it's fun. Like I that's my relationship to sports now. Is mostly it's like it's for me. I do it for fun. Like I like to weightlift because it's fun. Like I like to run because it does help me. So that's my personal relationship to like fitness, but my relationship to sports I think is much deeper, which is that it is community, whether it's fabricated or not. Like there's always the thing that you hear people talk about how like sports are a distraction or they're a way to like get people to not focus on issues. Like yeah, I think that there's some truth to that, but I also think that being part of a team environment is a community, and you meet people, and it's a way to like talk with people that you are rivals of your teams, and it's just it's mostly fun for me. And I do think it's a place where you can also learn from individuals who are trying to do their best and have to problem solve at a really high level and overcome adversity in different ways. And I find that really, this cheesy as hell, but I do find that like inspiring. So
we love cheese here.
Relationship to sport. We do.
Yeah, we do love cheese. Talked about it before we even started.
Yeah. Mikel or Kato?
Yeah, who wants to go first? Kato, are you ready?
Yeah, I've been mulling my answer over, but I think right now I hate the gym. I hate the gym. Oh God, it's so painful to go to the gym for me. So I use sport as a way to exercise. It's like I said earlier, I have ADHD, so I think being really highly engaged is something that I need to motivate myself to actually get exercise in. And sports have an external accountability that doesn't come with like I'm beholden to myself to go to the gym. So right now playing tennis with like my little tennis crew has been my recent relationship to sport. We've been like wanting to go to Indian Wells, the tennis tournament, because we're like right near Palm Springs. So it really has created like a community. I moved to California from Boston first. And then we spent a year in Colombia with my family, but I moved to California 2 years ago, and it's been really hard to make friends as an adult. And that tennis crew, and also UCI has an outdoor pool, so swimming with people has also been another way, because I swam in high school, has been another way that I've just like gotten out of the house working from home and like split up my work day. A sport I feel like has always been really essential in my life to feel like a motivated person because of that mental health aspect. Eric, I also realized like, oh, I'm pretty like I think I'm having like a little bit of a depressive episode if I haven't worked out in like a couple months. It's a really good indicator for me that, oh, I don't think I'm really doing that well mentally if I'm not like moving outside. And then just like a spectator. I love watching sports. My partner loves watching sports. I think that applies to most of, if not all of this crew. I love watching tennis. I love watching, if y'all haven't watched Breaking Point on Netflix, it follows like all the current like best tennis players out right now. And it's just like a fun community to participate in. I think it's just yeah, I think the community, and then Mikkel, you like hit the nail on the head with the self-discovery part, because it's also building a relationship with your body. I was doing Pilates for a while, and a big focus is like the mind-body connection and like matching up your breathing with like your body movements. And there's so much to say about what we learn about what we're capable of when we do what Eric said, and it's push our bodies to the limit and be like really proud of running your first half marathon, winning that tennis match you didn't think you were going to win. We need those wins in our 30s, you know? So I would say that that's like my relationship to sport right now, is like the little wins it gives me and the community it comes with.
Lilah, do you feel ready to go next?
Yeah, I can try. This is to me a harder question than your opener.
I only asked the toughest questions, maybe even
just,
impossible to answer.
but it is really something I've been thinking about a lot, because I guess just like sports for me is like the like literal like playing sports, but it's also sort of like it's been my place of work. It's like what I study. So I'm sort of like, what's my relationship to sports? Like, you mean like my whole like everything? And so I think, but I do think that kind of like it really just is pretty difficult. But I think my relationship is that I think like I like sports for me started out because of this like just pure love and joy that it brought me of being in my body. And much of my kind of like adulthood has been, okay, how do I use the opportunities I've been given in sport to try to do good and try to make sport better. And I think I've been working so hard on sort of some of the questions we've talked about today of like, how do we actually do that I am a little bit distanced right now from just the joy that it used to bring me. And so I think that's what I wish my relationship would be more is, I think, you know, I just moved to DC 3 months ago. And so I'm sort of, figuring out the spaces around me and the people around me, and am really identifying sport, kind of like Caro said, as like a way to make friends and build community. And so that's sort of the direction I'm going in is, how do I, sport just is like way too loaded for me right now. And I would really love to get to enjoy it more just as like a participant, just a simple, like, don't need to think about all the things, just be in my body. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank y'all for answering that question. I feel like I learned a lot about everyone's kind of relationship to sports. I feel like for me, I've been always down to try new sports. Like I started rugby for like a year when I was like 25 randomly, and then I got too injured and was also traveling for work too much, I think. And yeah, like I started lacrosse when I was in like college and played for a couple years. So I think I've always been like down to try new sports, and I think that I just like miss the competitiveness. Like I miss showing up to something because I cared about winning in a way that was like also no skin in the game, if that makes sense. Like there was like, now when I show up to win for something, it feels like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. It feels like, we're fighting for a public health win, we're fighting for a climate win, we're fighting for like a win that really matters to people's life and death situation. And I feel like sport emerged from this idea of like life and death situations. Like they were many times war games. And I think that we're still trying to shed a lot of the relationship to that really like kind of just simple but vicious like nature to some of these sports. And I think for me, being able to participate in something where the stakes are actually not that high. Like if the soccer mommies get kicked out of the tournament, I'm going to be devastated. We're going to talk so much shit about the other team. We're the sweetest, so we would never do that. But but to like show up and just like be able to participate in something with like some stakes to it and not feel like that energy of like, oh, this actually matters so much is really nice. And I think what I really want to have more of a goal around is orienting myself to getting back into the nature part of some of sports. Like maybe less it's the sport and more that fitness that Eric was talking about, of going out for walks and not like making it such like a high barrier to entry to just do simple activity that reminds me that, I need to be taking care of my body. I can't just be putting myself into sports that actually I can get injured from. My immediate inclination is always, why don't I go do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is like, as someone with like an ACL repaired knee and like really bad joints and who recently like sprained my ankle, I'm like, actually my body cannot take injuries of that magnitude anymore. Whereas before I used to roll my ankle like 3 times a basketball run and then like just get back up and keep on playing, and then I'd worry about it 3 days later. So yeah, I think that's my relationship to sport. But yeah, is there any other like final thoughts before we kind of wrap this convo?
I guess, yeah. One, I kind of have 2 things. The first is that just going back again one more time to like, okay, what are some like, what do we got to do to make sports this better space? I do think a lot of it has to do with like, again, like we need to sort of like value what coaches, what all the people like gym teachers, is something that's been, there's like the joke of like those who can't do teach and those who can't teach gym. And personally, like my gym teacher in high school was the person I like chose to hand me my high school diploma because he was so foundational to like who I am today. And I just think that a lot of our problems are really that we've like so devalued education around like our bodies. And so I think like some practical things are like, just like continuing to like push for more funding for physical activity and like pushing, like making that be a priority. And as well as like being like, like coaches are really shaping the way people understand their bodies as young people. And this is, I'm trying to be short, but it's just so hard. But there is going to be a lot, I think we see in the next coming years where there is going to be more coaching certifications probably required. And that's sort of resulting from a lot of what's happened with sexual abuse in sports, Larry Nassar, and we're going to start seeing that coming from like the government is requiring a lot more scrutiny around who's coaching and working with our kids. And there already is like a good bit, but a lot of the certification that I think is going to be required of coaches is going to be super compliance based. And it's not going to be so much about what we've been talking about today of getting coaches to like critically think about what are your values, what are you teaching kids, and this more kind of like holistic way of thinking about the art of coaching. And I think that's something like in your communities to push for, is go beyond the compliance. Like, does your coach know who to report to? Yeah, they need to know that, but also they need to know like what are they bringing to this context, and like and yeah, like what kind of ideas are they teaching people in sport. And so that's something I could talk about for a really long time. And then the second piece is I would just love to like point folks in a couple directions for people who know more than me about sport, and just like give some resources for listeners. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
We'll also make sure to like list them in the site. So.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So one thing I want to just mention is, highlighting the graduate program I just graduated from. So again, University of Maryland, Physical Cultural Studies. And just a big shout out to Dave Andrews and Shannon Jetty, who are professors there. And really, they're sort of people to go to thinking about sport in this really critical, nuanced way. If you're really interested in this stuff around Colin Kapernick and social justice in sport, a friend of mine, Brandon Wallace, is that's what his PhD dissertation is all about, is about Colin Kaepernick and what he's doing with his brand now. Another person to check out, if you're interested in college sports, name, image, likeness. Jesse Doherty at the Washington Post has been really covering it in a really awesome, critical way, and covering unionization, as well as Shannon Scoville, a professor at the University of Tennessee. And she's doing a lot of good work to kind of talk about how name, image, likeness isn't just about, especially for female athletes, there's a lot of ideas around female athletes are just using, or it's going to be harmful in some ways for women because they're going to be encouraged to kind of objectify themselves to get brand deals and things like that. Dr. Scoville has like a lot to say about that. So if it's something you're interested in, check out her work. And finally, for just questions around kind of like gender binary, what does it mean to be a woman in sport? Dr. Anna Posberg at Florida State University has been doing some really awesome work around the different policies that have been coming out. And so those are just a couple of people that have really shaped the way I think about this that I got a shout out. So thanks for letting me do that.
I love giving
Yeah.
credit to the people that do the work, Well, again, just want to thank Lilah for joining us today, and really hope that y'all enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. I think we're going to have like a part 7 and 8 at some point. Just kidding. Maybe just like a part 2 and 3. But yeah, I think what I'm taking away from this is, one, getting back into that place where those memories of playing on the playground, those kind of like the joy of playing kickball and just being in sport that wasn't so heavy is more a part of our life. I think also building community, and if you did not have the experiences that you wanted to enjoy in sports, it's now probably you're at a time where you can build that better for some other people. And I think the final thing that I would say is, I really did take away a lot about this idea of, we may not be able to create the preventative care within sports that we're needing, but we should at least offer and create the resources that are littered throughout the system of sports. Like every team should have someone with a psychotherapy background, and that be an offering that is consistent and maybe not mandatory, but at least voluntary for athletes. And yeah, there's just so many other things that I can think about when I think about the sports system and relationship that we can be doing better and align them with the values that we have and want to see for the world, because we don't need a bunch of traumatized people that are entertaining us, continuing to traumatize other people. I think what we really need is an ability for us as a society to enjoy sport, to view it with less guilt and shame, and also to support and enjoy the what is just a beautiful thing that we as humans can do at the highest level. So hope you enjoyed this episode of Upon Request. Thank you and peace out.